Blood hit the floor before anyone could move. Trauma Bay 6 had become a war zone in 60 seconds flat. Monitors screaming, IV lines tangled, 3 senior physicians shouting over each other while a man's heart forgot how to beat. The flatline was merciless, and every doctor in that room had run out of ideas. Then the quiet nurse in the corner put down her chart. She didn't ask permission. She didn't raise her voice. She just walked through them like they were furniture and said low and steady, "Move, he's not dying today." Nobody moved, so she made them. If you've never seen a room full of arrogant men go completely silent because of one woman, stay with me. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled, because what happened next inside Mercy Holloway Medical Center changed everything. And nobody saw it coming. The shift started at 6:15, which meant Claire Waverly had been awake since 4. That was habit, not insomnia. 15 minutes of cold water on her face, 20 minutes of movement in the small back room of her apartment that she still thought of as PT, even though nobody was timing her anymore. Then coffee, black, no sugar, standing over the kitchen sink watching the parking lot fill up one car at a time. She wasn't sentimental about mornings. She just needed them to be quiet before everything else stopped being quiet. Mercy Holloway Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Briar Falls, Oregon, a mid-sized city that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be a college town or a medical hub, and was awkwardly trying to be both. The hospital itself was 12 stories of reinforced concrete and glass that the administration liked to call state-of-the-art in their brochures, and that the ER staff called the pit in everything but official correspondence. It had 4 trauma bays, 2 surgical suites dedicated to emergency cases, a rooftop helipad that got more use than anyone ever publicly admitted, and a charge nurse rotation system that Claire had spent 3 months learning before anyone bothered to explain it to her. She had been on staff for 9 weeks. 9 weeks was long enough to learn which vending machine on the second floor actually dispensed what the buttons promised, which attending physician signed off on supply requisitions without reading them, and which ones would make your shift miserable if you so much as handed them the wrong clipboard. It was not, apparently, long enough to be taken seriously by Dr. Maren Osfeld. Osfeld was chief of emergency medicine, and she operated the department the way some people operate a personal fiefdom, with complete confidence that her authority was both absolute and self-evidently correct. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-featured, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of posture that made residents straighten up involuntarily when she entered a room. She had trained at Hopkins, done her fellowship at Mass General, and published enough to fill a small shelf. She was also, by almost every observable metric, brilliant. She was also the person who had said, on Claire's 3rd day, in front of 4 other staff members, "Where did you say you trained again?" Because whoever taught you to triage clearly had very low expectations. Claire had said nothing. She had written down the patient's vitals on the chart, completed the handoff, and gone to restock the supply cart in Bay 3. Later, in the locker room, one of the newer residents, a young woman named Priya, who went out of her way to be kind to everyone, had found her and said quietly, "She does that to everyone new. Don't take it personally." "I'm not," Claire had said. And she wasn't, exactly. She had just filed it. That was something she had learned a long time ago, in a context that had nothing to do with hospital hallways. You didn't have to react to every provocation. You just had to remember it accurately. The problem with Osfeld wasn't that she was cruel, precisely. The problem was that she had a theory about nurses, and that theory was almost entirely about function. Nurses administered, nurses monitored. Nurses were, in Osfeld's operational framework, highly trained support staff whose job was to execute physician decisions efficiently and without deviation. The idea that a nurse might observe something a physician had missed or, worse, know something a physician didn't, was not a possibility she had seriously entertained in probably 20 years of practice. Claire had run into this before, not at this scale, and not with someone who held quite this much institutional leverage, but the basic shape of it was familiar. She kept her head down. She did her job. She was thorough about it in ways that weren't obvious unless you were paying attention, and most people weren't paying attention to her, which was fine. What she was not was invisible. Dr. Garrett Lund noticed her on her 2nd week, Lund was the senior trauma attending on evening rotation, tall, late 40s, with a slightly rumpled quality that made him look perpetually like he'd just come off a 12-hour shift, even at the start of one. He had a reputation for being technically excellent and personally difficult, which in Claire's experience described a large percentage of trauma surgeons. He'd watched her work on a motorcyclist who'd come in with road rash severe enough to expose bone on his left forearm and a probable pneumothorax that 2 other nurses had missed on intake. She hadn't missed it. She'd flagged it before the patient hit the bay, gotten the imaging ordered, and had everything set up for chest decompression before Lund even walked through the door. He hadn't said anything about it directly. But afterward, when she was charting at the station, he had stopped beside her and looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone revising a prior assumption. "You were Army?" he said. Not asked. Said like he was confirming something he'd already worked out. "No," she said, without looking up. He waited. "Marines," she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and walked away. That was the entirety of the exchange, but she noticed that after that, he didn't talk over her when they were in the same trauma bay. It wasn't warmth, it was just accuracy. He had updated his information, and he behaved accordingly. Most people didn't bother. The worst of it, in the daily way, wasn't even Osfeld. It was a senior nurse named Douglas Pratt, who had been at Mercy Holloway for 11 years and had developed in that time a very specific hostility toward anyone who came in from outside and failed to show sufficient deference to his accumulated institutional knowledge. He was competent, probably, in a narrow and calcified way. He was also the kind of person who commented on how Claire restocked the supply cart, how she positioned herself during a resuscitation, the way she wore her hair under her cap. "You're always standing like you're about to get in a fight," he said, one morning in week 4, while they were both waiting for a patient transfer. "It makes the families nervous." She had looked at him. "The families are nervous because their person is in the emergency room," she said, "not because of my posture." He hadn't liked that. He'd gone to the charge nurse about it. She'd heard later that he'd described her as difficult to integrate into the team dynamic. And the charge nurse, a woman named Rosario who had clearly dealt with Pratt for years and maintained her sanity by being very literal about documentation, had asked Claire if she was having interpersonal conflicts with other staff. "No," Claire said. "Good," Rosario said. "Then there's nothing to document." Claire appreciated Rosario. The morning that everything changed was a Tuesday in November, and it started the way bad Tuesdays in emergency medicine tend to start, with too much happening at once for no apparent reason, and the ambient sense that the shift had a logic to it that wasn't going to resolve neatly. By 8 a.m., they had a 4-car collision on Route 9 that was sending them 6 patients over the next 40 minutes, a septic patient in Bay 2 whose condition had deteriorated overnight and who now needed a higher level of care than the floor could provide, and a pediatric case in triage that Claire had taken one look at and immediately escalated because the child's breathing pattern was wrong in a way that the initial vitals didn't fully capture. She was in the middle of setting up Bay 1 for the incoming trauma when Osfeld appeared at her shoulder. "The Hendricks child in triage," Osfeld said. "You escalated her." "Yes?" "The oxygen saturation was 94. That's within acceptable range." Her accessory muscles were engaged, Claire said, not stopping what she was doing. She was working to maintain that saturation. At rest, with normal breathing effort, 94 would be borderline. With that much compensatory effort, it means she's closer to the edge than the number looks. A pause. "I'm aware of what accessory muscle use indicates, Nurse Waverly." "Then we're in agreement," Claire said. She was aware that this was not the right thing to say. She said it anyway because she was tired and because the child in triage was 6 years old, and because there was a correct answer to this clinical question, and it was not Osfeld's answer. Osfeld looked at her for a long moment. "When I want your clinical opinion, I will ask for it." "Of course," Claire said. "Stay in your scope." She turned away, and Claire watched the back of her white coat disappear through the bay door. And then she went back to setting up the trauma bay, and she thought, not for the first time, that scope of practice was a genuinely useful concept that certain physicians had learned to use as a silencing mechanism rather than a safety tool. The distinction mattered. Nobody ever said so out loud in a place like this. The pediatric patient, for what it was worth, deteriorated 40 minutes later and required an emergency airway. The resident who finally caught it used the language of sudden decompensation, which Claire found professionally but quietly infuriating. Nothing about it had been sudden if you'd been watching her breathe. The first wave from Route 9 arrived at 8:37. There were 6 incoming, but the dispatch had been updated twice in the 20 minutes since the original call, and by the time the ambulances actually rolled in, it was 8 patients across 4 vehicles, with a 9th being airlifted from the scene because the paramedics on site had made the correct call that she wasn't going to survive the road trip. The helipad alert went out at 8:41. Claire had worked mass casualty events before. Not here, not in a civilian context, but the underlying architecture of the situation was familiar enough that her body knew what to do before her conscious mind had finished processing the new information. She moved to the coordination point at the bay entrance, took her position, and started sorting. 2 of the incoming patients were walking wounded, lacerations, likely fractures, frightened but stable. She directed them to the lower priority area without breaking stride. A 3rd was a middle-aged man who was conscious but confused, left side deficit, head strike against the windshield almost certainly. She called for neurology consult on her way past. A 4th and 5th were being brought in on boards, both with cervical collars, and she watched the paramedics' movement and listened to the handoff and started pulling what she was going to need in Bay 4. The 6th patient arrived unconscious and already intubated, with penetrating abdominal trauma from a metal strut that had come through the windshield. He was actively hemorrhaging and his pressure was in the basement, and Lund was already moving toward him with the kind of focused speed that bypassed every unnecessary social gesture. "Waverly," he said, without looking at her. "Here," she said, which was all either of them needed. She worked the resuscitation alongside him for the next 22 minutes, which was as much a physical exercise as a cognitive one. And in that time she registered, in the peripheral, cataloging part of her attention that never fully turned off, that Pratt was on the far side of the bay and moving more slowly than the situation demanded, and that the trauma resident assigned to Bay 4 was technically doing everything right, but hadn't yet developed the specific quality of anticipation that separated good emergency medicine from great emergency medicine. She registered these things and kept moving. The helicopter landed at 9:16. She heard it from inside the bay, the specific percussion of rotor blades on the rooftop pad, and noted it without stopping what she was doing. Helicopter arrivals were managed by the charge nurse and the receiving team on the pad level. She wasn't on that rotation today. She was still in Bay 4 when Rosario's voice came over the internal paging system, clipped and professional, and carrying beneath its neutrality a specific quality that Claire had learned to recognize. The quality of someone who was controlling their register very deliberately because the situation required it. Trauma team to Bay 6, priority incoming, rooftop transfer. All available attending physicians to Bay 6. All available attending physicians. That phrasing was unusual. It meant the patient was the kind of patient who required backup at the receiving level before anyone even knew the full extent of what they were dealing with. Claire finished the task in front of her. A specific, time-sensitive step in the hemorrhage control protocol that couldn't be handed off mid-procedure. And then she stripped her outer gloves, flagged the resident to continue, and walked out of Bay 4. She was not assigned to Bay 6. She wasn't moving toward it out of curiosity, exactly. It was more that she had learned, over a long time, and in conditions much less comfortable than this one, that the moments when official channels got stretched were precisely the moments when having one more person who could actually do something mattered most. She heard the voices before she got to the bay entrance. Osfeld was already inside, and so was the surgical fellow on call, and there were 2 people in dark clothing who were not hospital staff. She registered that immediately, something in their bearing and their positioning that was specific and familiar, and on the trauma table was a man in his mid-50s with a field dressing applied to his lower abdomen that was already saturated, and monitoring leads being attached in a controlled rush, and a blood pressure reading on the portable monitor that made Claire's chest go slightly cold. 62/40. The field dressing was military grade, not the kind that came in civilian ambulances. She'd recognize the packaging anywhere. She stood in the entrance to the bay and assessed. Osfeld was moving efficiently, calling out orders, and the team was responding, and Claire looked at the patient and the injury presentation, and the monitors, and the two people in dark clothing who were watching the resuscitation with the controlled anxiety of people who were professionally trained not to show anxiety. And something clicked into place behind her eyes. She had seen this. Not this patient, not this room, but this, the specific constellation of mechanism and presentation. She had seen it in a different context, a much louder and less sterile context. And she knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with experience exactly what was happening inside this man's body. The bleeding wasn't from the wound site everyone was focused on. The field dressing was correct for the surface injury. The surface injury was real. But the pressure, 62/40 and still dropping, she could see it on the monitor now at 59. That wasn't consistent with what they were treating. She ran through it. Entry point, trajectory, abdomen, field management, pressure loss rate. There was a second site. Posterior, most likely. Something that had been missed in the initial field assessment, possibly because the patient had been in a position that concealed it, possibly because the field team had triaged the most visible presentation first, and there hadn't been time to do more. It was a survivable injury if you caught it in the next few minutes. It was not survivable if you didn't. She was already inside the bay. "There's a secondary bleed," she said. Her voice came out even, which she was glad for. Posterior. The pressure drop isn't explained by the anterior wound management. Osfeld's head turned. The expression on her face moved through several phases very quickly. Surprise, irritation, the specific affront of being interrupted in a critical situation by a nurse. "Waverly, you're not assigned to this bay." "I know," Claire said. She had moved to the left side of the table where the angle gave her what she needed. "I need to assess the posterior aspect. We are managing this patient. His pressure is 56, Claire said. The number had just appeared on the monitor, and she had seen it and set it before the volume alarm caught up. "That's not the anterior wound. Something was missed in field management. I need 30 seconds to confirm." The surgical fellow looked at the monitor, looked at Osfeld. This was the moment. Claire knew this moment from many previous versions of it, where institutional hierarchy either got someone killed or stepped back. "Let her check," said a voice from the door. It was Lund. She hadn't heard him arrive. He was standing in the bay entrance with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing it did when he had already made a decision and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. "Garrett," Osfeld began. 56 systolic and dropping. Let her check." 3 seconds of silence that felt much longer than 3 seconds. Osfeld stepped back. Not far. Just enough. Claire moved. She was efficient about it because efficiency was the point. She had 30 seconds of permission and the patient had even less than that, and she used the access she had to confirm what she had already calculated was there. The assessment took 22 seconds. She straightened. "Left retroperitoneal," she said. "He needs surgical now, not in 10 minutes. If we don't get pressure control on that vessel, he won't make it to the OR." The room went very quiet. And then one of the two people in dark clothing, the one standing closer to the door, a woman with a compact, deliberate quality to her stillness, said something into her earpiece that Claire didn't catch, turned, and looked directly at Claire with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite alarm, but contained elements of both. "How did you identify that?" the woman said. Not challenging, genuinely wanting to know. "Mechanism, presentation, and pressure trend," Claire said. "Can we move this patient now?" Lund was already calling for surgical. The monitor showed 53. Osfeld had gone very still in a way that was different from her usual controlled stillness. This was the stillness of someone recalibrating in real time, which Claire recognized because she had been inside that experience herself more than once, and it was not comfortable. The surgical team arrived in the bay at a controlled sprint 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, and Claire stepped back because her part of this was done for now and watched them move the patient and thought about the pressure reading and the posterior assessment and ran through the confirmation of her own reasoning one more time, which she always did, not from self-doubt, but from discipline. She was still running through it when she felt someone standing beside her. She looked up. The woman from the doorway, dark clothing, earpiece, that quality of deliberate stillness, was watching her. You've done that before, the woman said. It wasn't a question. Not in a trauma bay. Claire looked at her. I don't know what you mean, she said. The woman almost smiled. It was a specific kind of almost smile, the kind that meant we both know that's not entirely true. And then she said very quietly, "We may need to talk to you later," and turned and walked back toward the bay entrance, pulling out her phone. Claire stood in the corridor outside Bay 6 and listened to the hospital resume its noise around her. Paging systems, rolling carts, the particular frequency of a place that never fully stopped, and thought about the patient on the table and his pressure reading and the surgical team working on him right now, and she thought about the woman in the doorway and the way she'd looked at her. And in the nursing station down the hall, she could see Osfeld at the counter, writing something, or pretending to write something, and not looking in her direction. And Pratt was somewhere behind her talking to a resident about something that was probably not important, and the rest of the shift was theoretically still ahead of her. She straightened her shoulders, which she always did without thinking about it, and walked back toward the supply station to check what Bay 4 had used, because the inventory wasn't going to update itself. She had almost reached the station when the overhead paging went silent, not to a new announcement, but into the specific silence that preceded an announcement that somebody had decided needed the room's full attention. The kind of silence the system operators used when they wanted to ensure nobody missed what was coming. Then Rosario's voice again, calmer than before, flatter. Security to the main entrance. Secondary authorization required for incoming personnel. All department heads to conference room 1. Immediate availability requested. Claire stopped walking. Conference room 1 was on the administrative floor. Immediate availability in this hospital's coded language meant not a request. She stood with one hand on the supply cart and turned this information over once, and looked at the closed door of Bay 6, and looked at the corridor where the woman in dark clothing had gone, and thought, carefully, with the specific quality of attention she had spent years learning to apply to situations that were not what they appeared to be on the surface, that the next few hours of this shift were going to be very different from the ones before them. The conference room summons sat in the back of her mind while she finished the inventory, and she let it sit there because there was nothing to do with it yet, and the supply cart wasn't going to wait. She counted the chest seal units twice. The first count came up short, which meant someone had pulled from the station without logging it, which happened more than it should, and made a note on the requisition sheet and moved on to the airway tray. Methodical. She had learned a long time ago that methodical was how you got through the parts of a situation where the larger shape of things hadn't revealed itself yet. You did the small tasks correctly. You kept your hands busy. You did not speculate beyond what the available information actually supported. The airway tray was fine. The IV supplies were low on the 18 gauge, but not critically. She logged it. Pratt materialized at the end of the corridor with the specific quality of someone who had been looking for an opportunity. She saw him coming from 20 feet away, not because she was watching for him, but because she had spent enough years in environments where situational awareness was the difference between going home and not going home, that it had simply become the default mode of her attention. "Administration's asking for you," he said. He managed to make it sound like bad news, which it might be. Osfeld called up. "I know," she said. "I heard the page." Conference room 1 isn't usually a good sign for someone still in probationary status. She looked at him for a moment. He had the expression of someone delivering a kindness, which was the expression he always used when he was doing something else. "Thanks for the context," she said, and walked past him. The elevator to the administrative floor was slow in the way that hospital elevators are always slow, as though the building itself was making a point. She stood inside it and looked at the floor numbers and thought about the patient in surgery and the pressure readings and the specific way the woman in dark clothing had looked at her, not with suspicion, not with gratitude exactly, but with the kind of focused attention that suggested Claire had just become relevant to something much larger than a Tuesday morning shift. She didn't know what that was yet. She was fairly sure she was about to find out. Conference room 1 was at the far end of the administrative corridor, past the development office and the HR suite, and a wall of framed photographs of former hospital directors going back to the 1970s. The door was closed. She could hear voices behind it. Not the words, just the register and rhythm, which told her there were at least 4 people inside and that the conversation had been going on long enough to get tense. She knocked, a pause. Then, "Come in." She opened the door. The room held more people than she'd expected. Osfeld was at the near end of the table, which meant she had arrived before Claire rather than after, which meant the call-up had been made before the page went out. The hospital's chief medical officer, a heavy-set man named Dr. Roland Petty, whom Claire had seen exactly twice in 9 weeks, once at a department all-hands and once in the parking structure, sat at the head of the table with the expression of someone who had been pulled into a situation he hadn't had time to fully brief himself on and was managing it by being very still. To Petty's left sat 2 people Claire did not recognize. Not the woman from the corridor, different people, different bearing, though they had a similar quality of compressed professional attention. A man in his early 50s with a military short haircut going gray at the temples and a charcoal suit that was slightly too good for a hospital meeting. Beside him, a younger woman with a tablet she wasn't looking at and eyes that had logged Claire the moment the door opened. And in the corner, standing rather than sitting, the woman from Bay 6. Watching. "Nurse Waverly," Petty said. "Please sit down." She sat, across from Osfeld, who was looking at a point approximately 6 inches to Claire's left. "We've been discussing what happened in Bay 6, Petty said. He had a careful way of speaking, the kind that came from years of managing conversations that had the potential to become liability events. Specifically, your intervention during the initial stabilization of the incoming patient. "All right," Claire said. "Dr. Osfeld has some concerns about the nature of that intervention." "I imagine she does," Claire said, which was not the politically optimal response, but it was the accurate one. Osfeld's gaze moved from the 6-inch point to Claire's face. "You entered a trauma bay you were not assigned to, interrupted active physician management of a critical patient, and performed a hands-on assessment without being authorized to do so." "Yes," Claire said. "That's a protocol violation." "The patient's systolic was 53 when I completed the assessment," Claire said. "If the secondary bleed had gone unidentified for another 4 or 5 minutes, the surgical team would have been managing a patient in full arrest rather than a patient in severe hemorrhagic shock. The outcome differential between those 2 scenarios is significant." "That's not the point. With respect, I think it is the point." She said it quietly, without heat. "I understand I deviated from protocol. I want to be accurate about why." The man in the charcoal suit, who had not introduced himself and showed no sign of planning to, leaned forward slightly. "How did you identify the secondary bleed, he said. His voice had a specific flatness to it that Claire associated with people who spent their professional lives asking questions they already had partial answers to. "Clinical assessment," she said. "The pressure drop was inconsistent with the anterior injury and the field management that had already been applied. The mechanism suggested the possibility of a posterior site. I assessed and confirmed." "That's a fairly sophisticated read for," he started. "For a nurse," she said, not quite cutting him off, close enough. "Yes, I know." Petty cleared his throat. "The patient is currently in surgery. The surgical team has confirmed the presence of a secondary injury consistent with your assessment." He paused, which complicates the disciplinary question somewhat. "I would think so," Claire said. "It doesn't eliminate it," Osfeld said. "Protocol exists for reasons. If every nurse on staff decided their individual clinical judgment superseded physician authority and established procedure, this department would be—" "I'm not arguing for that," Claire said. "I'm saying that this specific situation, at this specific moment, with that specific patient's pressure at that number and falling, I made a judgment call. I would make it again." The room went quiet. The woman in the corner, who had said nothing since Claire arrived, made a small sound that was not quite a word and raised her hand with the particular authority of someone who didn't need to raise her hand to be heard, but did it anyway as a social courtesy. "If I could," she said. Petty looked at her. "Ms. Farrell." So that was a name. "Farrell." Claire filed it. "We have some information that may be relevant to how this situation is framed," Farrell said. She was looking at Claire with the same focused quality she'd had in the corridor, but there was something additional now, something that sat at the edge of caution. We're waiting on confirmation from a federal agency before we can share it in full. What I can tell you at this point is that the patient in surgery is not a private individual, and the circumstances of his case fall under a jurisdiction that supersedes this institution's standard disciplinary protocols. Osfeld turned to look at her. What does that mean? It means, Farrell said, that how this hospital handles the next several hours is going to be reviewed by people who are not on this institution's board of directors. Petty's stillness became a different kind of stillness. I see, he said, which meant he didn't, not fully, but he understood the shape of it. Claire sat with her hands flat on the table and thought, there it is. She had suspected, from the field dressing and the bearing of the people accompanying the patient, and from Farrell's presence, that this was not an ordinary case. She had not speculated beyond what the evidence suggested because she had learned not to, but the shape of things was clarifying. Are we done for now? She asked. Farrell looked at her. Largely yes. One question. She glanced down at something on her phone, a brief consultation. Where did you do your trauma training? Claire met her eyes. Mercy Holloway's residency preceptorship program, she said, starting 9 weeks ago. Farrell didn't blink. Before that, a beat. I served, Claire said. I'm a nurse now. It was a complete sentence in every sense that mattered. Farrell looked at her for another moment and then nodded once, slowly, and looked back at her phone. You can go back to your shift, Petty said. He sounded tired. We'll be in touch. She stood, pushed in her chair, and left. The walk back down the administrative corridor was the same distance as the walk up it, but felt different, not longer or shorter, but more deliberate, like the building was paying attention to the direction of her movement. She passed the photographs of the former hospital directors. She waited for the elevator. She rode it back down to the ER level and walked back into the noise and the compressed urgency of a department that had continued happening without her for the past 25 minutes. Rosario was at the nursing station and looked up when Claire came through the doors. Her expression asked a question she didn't put into words. Fine, Claire said, which answered it adequately. Bay 3 needs a hand, Rosario said. Pratt's been covering, but the family is getting escalated, and he's... She made a gesture that communicated being Pratt without requiring elaboration. I'll go, Claire said. Bay 3 was a chest pain case that had come in from a care facility 2 hours ago and was in the process of being downgraded from cardiac to musculoskeletal. Still significant, but no longer the highest priority in the room. The patient was a woman in her late 60s named Marguerite, who had a dry wit and a strong opinion about the temperature of the room, and her daughter, who was in her 40s and had arrived 30 minutes ago and brought with her the specific energy of someone who managed anxiety through information acquisition. She needs a specialist, the daughter said to Claire before Claire had fully entered the bay. A cardiologist, not just a cardiologist is on call, Claire said. The attending has already requested a consult. It typically takes between 30 and 90 minutes depending on current surgical schedule. That's a huge range. It is, Claire agreed. The honest reason is that I don't know exactly when they'll be here. What I can tell you is that your mother's current readings are stable and the consult has been requested. The daughter absorbed this. She had the slightly deflated look of someone who'd been prepared to fight for information that had just been given to her directly. Okay, she said less aggressively. Okay, thank you. Marguerite from the bed. She does this everywhere. Don't take it personally. Mom, she managed a pharmaceutical company for 12 years. Everyone gets treated like a production problem. Claire checked the monitoring leads. One had shifted slightly, nothing critical but worth correcting, and made a note in the chart and told Marguerite that someone would be back within 30 minutes to update her on the consult timeline. She meant it, which made it easy to say. She was finishing the chart note at the corridor terminal when her phone buzzed. Not the hospital pager. Her personal cell, which she kept in her left pocket on silent during shifts. She almost never received calls during a shift that weren't missed dials. She looked at the screen. The number was a Virginia area code she didn't recognize. She stood with the phone in her hand for a moment, in the middle of the ER corridor with the noise of the department moving around her, and made a decision and answered it. Waverly, she said. A pause on the line. Then a voice she had not heard in over 3 years, male, measured, with the specific quality of someone who had spent 2 decades giving instructions over compromised radio channels and had never fully relaxed out of that register. "We have a situation," the voice said. "You're already in it." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Not much." "Enough." "I'm on shift," she said. "I know. The patient in your OR right now is Deputy Director Marcus Hale, Defense Intelligence. He was en route from a classified briefing and the vehicle was hit. It wasn't an accident." A pause. "We have active concerns about the security perimeter around that hospital right now." She turned without thinking and looked down the corridor. Both directions, the practiced reflex of someone running an environment assessment. The department looked like itself. That told her nothing useful. "How active?" she said. "Active enough that I'm calling you." She closed her eyes for approximately 1 second. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I left." "I know what you did," the voice said. "Which is why I'm calling." She opened her eyes. The corridor was the same corridor. Pratt was visible at the far end, talking to a resident. The paging system announced something routine about a patient transport on the 4th floor. Everything looked exactly like what it was. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Right now, stay in that building and don't leave the patient floor. We have people moving, but it's going to take time we may not have." "Farrell," she said. "Is she yours?" A beat that told her something. "Adjacent," the voice said. "Different agency. We're coordinating." "How many agencies are coordinating right now?" "More than I'm comfortable with," he said, which was the most honest thing she'd heard all morning. The call ended. She stood in the corridor with the phone in her hand and thought very deliberately about the next 60 seconds, which was a technique she'd learned for moments when thinking about anything longer than 60 seconds produced more noise than signal. Marcus Hale, Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence. In her OR right now, alive because of a posterior assessment that had taken 22 seconds and the willingness to walk into a bay she hadn't been assigned to. The vehicle hit was not an accident. Active security concerns around this building right now. 60 seconds. What did the next 60 seconds require? She pocketed the phone and walked with a normal pace, not faster than normal, down the corridor to the nursing station. Rosario was typing. Claire stood beside her and said quietly, without preamble, "Has anyone come onto the floor in the last 30 minutes who you didn't recognize? Not family, not staff. Someone who looked like they belonged without actually belonging." Rosario stopped typing. She turned and looked at Claire with an expression that had become, very quickly, something quite different from her default professional neutrality. "Why?" "I need you to think about it." Rosario thought. She was good at this, Claire had noticed. Good at accurate recall. Good at parsing what was actually being asked versus the surface form of the question. "There was a man from facilities management about 20 minutes ago checking the utility access panel at the East Corridor. I didn't recognize him, but facilities turnover is high and—" She stopped. "You think he wasn't from facilities?" "Where's the utility panel?" Claire said. "East Junction, past Bay 6. Bay 6? The room where Hale had first been brought. The room with the equipment logs and the blood evidence and the specific layout that someone who knew this building would find useful to understand if they were planning to be somewhere in this building they weren't supposed to be. "Can you reach security without using the general page?" Claire said. "I can call Hendricks directly," Rosario said. She was already picking up the desk phone. "Claire, what is happening?" "I don't know yet," Claire said. "Make the call, and then I need you to do something that's going to feel strange." "Stranger than this conversation?" "Probably. I need you to find out where Farrell is." Rosario's hand paused on the phone. "The woman from the federal—" "Yes. Don't go through administration. She may have given someone on the floor a direct contact." "May have." "Try." Rosario looked at her for a moment. The particular look of someone deciding how much they trusted the information embedded in an ask that hadn't been fully explained. And then she started dialing. Claire turned and walked toward the East Corridor. The utility panel was where Rosario had described, a gray metal cabinet set flush into the wall at the junction where the East Corridor met the service access hall, the kind of infrastructure that most people walked past 1,000 times without ever noticing it. It controlled the climate system feeds for this section of the floor, and she was almost certain the electrical circuit routing for the monitoring equipment in bays 5 through 8. The panel door was closed. Nothing visually wrong. She crouched and looked at the base of the wall beside it. There was a mark on the floor. Faint, barely there, the kind that comes from a boot sole pressing against linoleum at an angle while someone kneels. Recent enough to still have definition. The facilities teams wore rubber-soled work boots with a specific tread that left a particular mark. This was a different tread. She stood up. "You're looking at the panel," said a voice behind her. She turned. Lund was standing 8 feet away with his arms crossed, and the expression he used when he was working out whether to be concerned or annoyed and hadn't decided yet. "Rosario called me," he said. "She thought you might be in the East Corridor doing something that was going to require a physician present. I'm here under protest." "Who else did she call?" Claire said. "Hendricks from security, and she tried to reach the federal woman, Farrell, but she's not responding to the floor contact number." Not responding. Claire processed this. When did Farrell last check in with someone on the floor? Rosario says 40 minutes ago. She went toward the surgical wing to get an update on the patient. The surgical wing, where Marcus Hale was currently in an OR on the 4th floor, being kept alive by a trauma surgeon who had confirmed what Claire had identified 6 hours into the man's situation in a civilian emergency department. "We need to reach the OR," Claire said. "The patient is in active surgery." "I know." She looked at him. "Lund, someone is in this building who should not be in this building, and the patient in that OR is not a random patient, and Farrell is not picking up, and there is a non-standard boot print next to the utility panel that controls the electrical routing for half this floor." Lund was quiet for a moment. He looked at the panel. He looked at her. "You were military," he said. Not for the first time, but the weight of it was different now. "Yes," she said. "And right now you're telling me this situation has a shape you recognize." "Yes," she said. He uncrossed his arms. "What do you need?" She thought for 3 seconds. "Get to the surgical coordinator and find out exactly who has physically accessed the OR corridor in the last hour. Not authorized personnel, actual access. Who swiped in, who was escorted, who came in on an emergency override. I need that list." "And you?" "I'm going to find Farrell," she said. "Alone." "I'm a nurse in a hospital," she said. "I'm very hard to make look suspicious." He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him calculating, updating, deciding. 10 minutes, he said. "If I don't hear from you in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police and telling them everything you just told me." "That's fair," she said. "Make the surgical coordinator call first." She left him standing by the utility panel and walked back through the junction toward the main corridor, moving at the pace of someone with a destination and a reason to be going there, which was exactly what she was. Her shoes on the linoleum, the overhead lights, the paging system calling someone's name on the 3rd floor. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. She was halfway to the surgical wing elevator when she saw the door to the supply room at the corridor's midpoint sitting 2 inches open. It should not have been open. It was a coded access room. The door was heavy and self-closing. It required active effort to leave it ajar. Someone had propped it or pulled it closed imprecisely. She slowed, stopped, stood to the side of the door frame. She could hear breathing inside the supply room. Controlled breathing, not labored, not panicked. The breathing of someone trying to be quiet. There was a second sound under the breathing, lower. A voice, too quiet to make out words. Someone on a phone or a radio, speaking in a register designed to travel no further than the immediate space. She stood outside the cracked door of the supply room in the corridor of Mercy Holloway Medical Center on a Tuesday in November, with the sounds of a working hospital around her and the surgical wing 40 feet ahead, and she thought about the next 60 seconds. Then she heard a second voice inside the room. Not the quiet one on the radio, but a different voice, strained and low, with the particular tightness of someone managing pain or managing fear, or both. A voice she'd heard once, briefly, that morning. Farrell. She did not open the door. That was the first decision, made in under a second, and it was correct. Opening the door told whoever was inside that someone was outside, and she did not yet have enough information to know whether announcing herself was an asset or a liability. She needed 3 things before she moved. how many people were in that room, whether Farrell was mobile, and whether the person on the radio was armed. She got 2 of the 3 in the next 90 seconds by standing very still and listening. The radio voice spoke twice more. Short transmissions, clipped, the cadence of someone working a check-in protocol. Single person on comms, which didn't tell her how many were physically present, but the room was not large and she could only distinguish one set of movement sounds. The weight distribution of that movement, where the floor gave slightly under a footstep, the particular give of the linoleum she'd learned over 9 weeks, suggested someone standing near the far shelving wall, roughly 10 feet from the door. Farrell's voice came again, strained but coherent. "You're running out of time," she said, to whoever was in the room with her, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who was injured but not incapacitated and was using conversation the way you used it when you were buying minutes. Not to communicate information, but to stay relevant, to keep the other person talking, to prevent whatever was about to happen from happening yet. Claire had done that. She knew what it felt like from the inside. She needed something. She looked at the corridor around her, the ordinary inventory of a hospital hallway, the things that lived here because they were always here, the things nobody noticed because they were always here. Wall-mounted Sharps container to her left, portable IV pole folded and leaning against the wall 3 feet further on, emergency call button panel beside the supply room door, the kind that triggered a floor alert if pressed. She did not want to trigger a floor alert, not yet, not without knowing what it would cause the person inside to do. The IV pole. She moved to it. 3 steps, quiet. Her shoes had soft soles and she kept her weight forward and lifted it from the wall. Aluminum, lightweight, collapsible. Not a weapon in any conventional sense. But it had a weighted base and it had reach, and more to the point, it had a specific use that she was calculating as she moved back to the doorframe. She positioned herself to the hinge side of the door, not the handle side where the door would swing if someone pushed out from inside, and breathed once, and pushed the door open with the end of the pole and stepped back immediately. The door swung. No one came through it. From inside, movement, fast, the sound of someone pivoting, then silence, then, "Who's there?" Male voice, lower than the radio voice, with a tightness to it that told her he'd been startled and was recalibrating. Not a professional who'd been expecting this, someone who thought he had more time than he did. She did not answer. "I have her," the voice said, louder now, aimed at the doorway. "Walk away." 3 pieces of information in 4 words. He had Farrell, which she already knew. He was warning her off, which meant he didn't want an audience, which meant his plan still required time he hadn't used yet. And he was talking, which meant he was uncertain. She stepped into the doorway. The room was a mid-sized supply closet, shelving on 3 walls, a narrow central space, overhead fluorescent that flickered slightly on the left side. The man was at the back, near the far shelving. Mid-30s, dark jacket, the build of someone who was fit in a functional rather than cosmetic way. He had one hand on Farrell's left arm. Farrell was on her feet, which was better than the alternative, but her left side was wrong. She was favoring it, and there was a dark stain on the fabric above her hip that Claire identified immediately and catalogued without comment. Farrell looked at Claire. For a fraction of a second, her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the specific recalibration of someone adjusting their strategy to account for a new variable. "This is a hospital," Claire said. Her voice came out level, which was what she wanted. "You're in a supply room. There are cameras in the corridor you came through and another one on the stairwell exit. Whatever you're here to do, you've already run out of clean options." The man looked at her, a quick, assessing look, the kind that was trying to determine what category she fell into. "You're the nurse," he said. Not a question. She'd been made, somehow. From the corridor camera feeds, from a description, from the meeting in Bay 6. Someone had been watching the floor. "Yes," she said. "Walk away," he said again. His grip on Farrell's arm tightened and Farrell's jaw tightened in response, but she didn't make a sound. Claire looked at him. She was thinking about the radio, the check-in protocol she'd heard through the door, and thinking about timing, and thinking about the fact that she was holding an IV pole in a supply closet and was alone, and the 10-minute window she'd given Lund was probably at 6 minutes now. "The check-in you just ran," she said. "What happens if you miss the next one?" His expression changed, slightly. "Enough." "Because you're going to miss it," she said, "and whoever is on the other end of that is going to know something went wrong, which means you have less time than you think, and I have more options than you're accounting for." It wasn't a bluff exactly, it was a statement about the logical structure of his situation, which happened to also serve her purposes. The distinction mattered to her even if it didn't matter to him. He moved, not toward her, but sideways, repositioning, pulling Farrell with him, trying to get to the door from an angle that kept her between him and Claire. Standard, predictable. She had known he would move, and she had known which direction. She stepped into the angle instead of away from it, which surprised him. People in supply closets with IV poles generally stepped back, and used the 2 seconds of his surprise to close distance. And what happened in the next 4 seconds was not clean or elegant, or the way it would happen in a version of events cleaned up for later retelling. She got an elbow into his forearm. Not hard enough. She was at an awkward angle, and she knew it. And he turned faster than she'd expected, and there was a moment where she was genuinely on the wrong side of this, where the leverage was wrong and the space was too small, and she had overcorrected, and he grabbed her left wrist and pulled, and she went into the shelving. The shelving was metal. The corner of it caught her left shoulder, and she felt it immediately. A hot, specific pain that told her something had taken a hit, but was not, in the immediate moment, compromised. She filed it, stayed on her feet. That part mattered. Farrell, in the moment his attention had moved to Claire, had done something economical and accurate with her free arm that connected with his right ear at close range. Not a martial technique. Just someone who'd worked out in a confined space the fastest way to cause pain with what they had available. He made a sound and his grip went loose for a half second. Half a second was enough. Farrell pulled away from him and put herself on the other side of the room's central space, which was not far but was enough, and then the three of them were standing in a triangle in a supply closet, and someone on the corridor outside tried the door and found it open and stopped. She turned her head. Not enough to lose sight of the man, just enough to see. Lund, standing in the doorway with his phone in his hand and an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who had completely exhausted their ability to categorize what they were looking at. "Call security," Claire said. "Tell them he's supply room, level 2, and tell them to contact Farrell's agency, not just hospital security." "I already—" he started. "Do it again," she said. "Tell them the room specifically." He was on the phone before she finished the sentence. The man in the dark jacket looked at the doorway, looked at Claire. Did the calculation that she had already done, which was that the corridor behind Lund was filling up, she could hear it, the particular quality of sound that indicated people moving with purpose, and that his exit window had just closed. He sat down on the floor. He put his hands visible on his knees. It was the action of someone who had made a professional decision, not a personal one. Farrell said something in a low, rapid voice into her own earpiece that Claire didn't catch. Then she leaned against the wall and put her hand over the dark stain on her left side and said to Claire, with the particular economy of someone who was managing pain and information simultaneously, "Left lateral abdomen, entry wound. You used something small. I didn't feel it initially." "How long ago?" Claire said. 30 minutes, maybe. I've been applying pressure." 30 minutes. Claire moved to her immediately, going into the clinical space she knew how to occupy, and looked at what Farrell had been managing. A small puncture wound, lateral, below the rib margin, with the specific pattern of blood loss that suggested the bleeding was real, but not immediately catastrophic, which meant 30 minutes of pressure had been doing its job. "You need to go upstairs," Claire said. "I know that." "Can you walk?" "Yes, slowly." "Good." Claire straightened and looked at Lund, who was off the phone and standing inside the doorway now, having apparently decided that being in the room was better than being in the corridor. "I need a gurney. Not for the patient. For the equipment. I'm not moving her on foot more than 40 feet. He turned around and was gone. She turned back to Farrell. "What did he need from you?" Farrell looked at her steadily. "Authorization codes for the OR access override." "Did he get them?" "No," Farrell said, And then, with the slight emphasis of someone making a point they considered important, "That's what I was buying time for." Claire looked at her. "I know," she said. "I could tell from the voice." Something shifted in Farrell's expression. "Not much." "You know that technique." "Yes," Claire said. They looked at each other, and it was the kind of look that contained a significant amount of information being exchanged without being spoken. And then Lund was back with the gurney and two orderlies who had the expressions of people who had been told something urgent without being told what. And they moved Farrell into the corridor. Security arrived in force at the East Supply Room 40 seconds later. Hospital security first, then two men who were not hospital security and moved differently and had the same quality of compressed professional attention that Farrell had. The man on the floor with his hands on his knees was extracted with a minimum of noise, which was the correct approach for a hospital corridor at mid-morning. Claire did not watch this. She was with Farrell on the gurney, moving toward the elevator. In the elevator, Farrell said, "The OR is still active. Hale is still in surgery." "How much longer?" Claire said. "They projected 4 hours from incision. We're at 2 hours 40. So another 80 minutes, roughly, if there are no complications." The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. Claire guided the gurney out and flagged the surgical floor nurse, a compact woman named Brigitte, who took one look at the situation and immediately cleared a bay. Claire gave her the rundown: mechanism, duration, field management, current status, in the compressed clinical shorthand that transferred information as fast as language allowed, and Brigitte repeated it back at the same speed, which was how Claire knew she'd been heard accurately. "I'll stay," Claire said to Farrell when Brigitte had moved to prep the bay. "You don't need to," Farrell said. "I know." Farrell looked at her from the gurney. Her color was not good. The blood loss over 30 minutes had taken a toll that professional composure could only carry so far. "You were Special Operations Medical Sergeant," she said. It was not a question. Claire said nothing. "You went out of service voluntarily," Farrell said. "I pulled the file summary when your name came up this morning. It was redacted in 3 places, which usually means either something went badly wrong or the record is protecting something else." "Or both," Claire said. "Or both," Farrell agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you're here? Briar Falls, civilian nursing, 9 weeks on staff in a department that doesn't appreciate you?" Claire considered the question. It was a reasonable question, and it deserved an answer that was at least partially true. "I needed something to be simple for a while," she said. Farrell almost smiled. "How's that working out?" "Today's an outlier," Claire said. Brigitte came back and they moved Farrell into the bay, and the evaluation began, and Claire stepped back to the threshold and let it be someone else's work for a moment. Her left shoulder ached in a way that suggested the bruise was going to be significant by tomorrow. She rotated it once, carefully, and assessed. Range of motion intact, no structural compromise, manageable. She filed it. Her phone buzzed. The Virginia number again. "She's on the 3rd floor," Claire said before the voice on the other end could speak. "Puncture wound, lateral abdomen, hemodynamically stable. Your man in the East Supply Room is in hospital security custody, and I assume your people are taking that over." A pause. "They are," the voice said. "The OR is secure. We have agents on the surgical floor." "Good." "Waverly," the voice stopped, started again. "You should know that Deputy Director Hale was conscious briefly before surgery. He asked about the nurse who identified the secondary bleed. He asked who she was." "He doesn't know me," Claire said. "He asked anyway." She stood in the threshold of the bay where Brigitte was working on Farrell and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was a habit she had never fully explained to anyone. "Is he going to survive?" she said. "The surgical team thinks yes," the voice said, "because of what you did at intake." She said nothing. "There are people who are going to want to talk to you today," the voice said. "More than Farrell's people. People who are not going to take 'I'm a nurse' as a complete answer." "I know," she said. "You need to be prepared for what gets reopened." She thought about that. The redacted file. The 3 places. The thing she had spent 9 weeks trying to put at a sufficient distance. "I'm aware of what's in the record," she said. "Are you aware of what was added to it?" the voice said. "In the last 6 months. She went still. "There's context you don't have," the voice said. "The reason your name was flagged this morning wasn't only because you were on shift when Hale came in. We have a watch list, protective flag. It went active when your badge swiped into Mercy Holloway at 6:15. She processed this. The specific texture of what he was saying, a protective flag, a watch list, her badge swipe triggering a federal notification, required more than the 30 seconds she had to process it. "Why?" she said. "Because there's an ongoing investigation," the voice said, "that intersects with the operation you left, the one you walked away from." The corridor was very ordinary around her, nursing staff moving, a patient being transferred in a wheelchair by a volunteer in a blue vest, the fluorescent lights overhead that never quite matched the quality of natural light. "Send me what you can send," she said. "It's not that simple. What I can do is get you into a briefing as soon as the surgical situation stabilizes." A pause. "The people who are going to want to talk to you, some of them are on your side, Waverly. I want to be clear about that, but some of them are going to ask questions about what happened at Kandahar Station, and I need you to know that before you answer anything, you don't have to answer." Kandahar Station. She had not heard those words in 3 years. The specific way they landed in her chest was not something she had anticipated, even though she should have. "All right," she said. "Stay in the building," the voice said. "We're 45 minutes out." The call ended. She stood in the corridor and let Kandahar Station sit in her chest for exactly as long as it needed to, and not 1 second longer, and then she put it somewhere she could come back to and went back to work. The third-floor surgical ward had its own rhythms, quieter than the ER, more deliberate, with the specific weight of a floor where the outcomes were still being decided. She found a terminal near the nursing station and pulled up the surgical floor log because Lund had asked the surgical coordinator about access, and she wanted to see if the results had come back. They had. Lund had forwarded the list to the floor terminal at 10:47 a.m., 15 minutes ago. She read through it. 11 authorized personnel had swiped into the surgical corridor in the last hour. 10 of them were surgical staff, anesthesia, or nursing. She recognized 8 of the names, could account for the other 2 by department. The 11th entry was a facilities management authorization code that had been used at 9:52 a.m. to access the corridor through the service entrance. Facilities management, same cover that had been used at the utility panel on the ER floor. She looked at the service entrance access log. 1 entry in, no corresponding exit. The man from the supply room had been extracted at 10:20 a.m. The facilities code had accessed the surgical corridor at 9:52, 28 minutes earlier. She straightened up from the terminal. "There's a second one," she said, to no one in particular, and then immediately pulled out her phone. Lund picked up on the second ring. "Where are you?" she said. "ER level, I just got back." "Waverly, what?" "Call your contact in the federal group directly, not hospital security. Tell them the facilities management cover was used twice, once on the ER level and once to access the surgical corridor at 9:52 a.m. The ER level person is in custody. The surgical corridor entry has no exit log. Someone is still in the surgical wing." A beat. "Christ," Lund said. "Make the call," she said. "Right now." She was already moving toward the OR wing. The OR corridor was accessed through a set of double doors with a badge reader, staff only, the kind of institutional checkpoint that was very effective at keeping out civilians and very permeable to anyone with a functional authorization code. She swiped her own badge. The reader went green. She pushed through. The corridor on the other side was quieter than the floor, the particular hush of a space where the ambient noise was reduced to allow concentration, where the overhead lights were brighter and more even, and where the rubber floors absorbed footsteps in a way that made distance difficult to judge. 4 OR suites in a row on the left side. Indicator lights above each door, green for unoccupied, amber for in progress. Suite 3 was amber. That was where Hale was. She looked at the corridor, at its full length, at the doors on the right side, equipment storage, scrub anteroom, a supply corridor that ran parallel to the OR suites, and allowed equipment to be moved without crossing the sterile zone. The supply corridor door at the far end was not fully closed. Same as the supply room on the ER level, 2 inches open. Not an accident. She thought about the next 60 seconds. She thought about the agents the voice on the phone had said were on the surgical floor, and looked around the corridor for them and saw no one, which either meant they were in positions she couldn't see from here, or meant they had not yet received Lund's call, or meant something she didn't want to think about yet. She walked toward the supply corridor door. Not fast. Fast was wrong in a space like this, while fast was what you did when you had backup and clear sight lines and knew the terrain. She didn't have any of those things. She had a hospital badge and soft-soled shoes, and the knowledge that inside OR Suite 3, a surgical team was working on a patient who needed every one of the next 80 minutes to go without interruption. She reached the supply corridor door and stood beside it and listened, and heard, from inside, a sound that should not have been there. The particular, unmistakable frequency of a ventilator alarm being physically silenced, not powered down, physically muted. The ventilators in the supply corridor fed the backup oxygen systems for the OR suites, Suite 3 included. If the backup supply was compromised and the primary system was interrupted, even briefly, even for 30 seconds, the anesthesia team would be managing a crisis instead of a surgery, and a patient with a compromised vascular repair and an open chest cavity would be in immediate danger. She did not wait. She pushed the door open and went in. The supply corridor was narrow and long, with equipment bays on both sides and a lighting system that ran on motion sensors, which meant the first 10 feet were lit by spillover from the OR corridor, and everything beyond that was in the process dimness of sensors that hadn't triggered yet. She moved left immediately, away from the center line, putting something solid at her back, and let her eyes adjust. The man was at the far end of the corridor, bent over an equipment console she recognized as the backup oxygen distribution panel. He was not in facilities management clothing. He was in surgical scrubs, the full set, cap and mask included, pulled down now because there was no one he needed to fool in here. He was working with something in his hands that she couldn't identify at this distance. He had not heard her come in. The muffled quality of the supply corridor walls worked against her entrance, but had also been working against his awareness of the activity in the OR corridor. She looked at the distance. 30 feet, approximately. The floor was clear. She could see 3 equipment bays between her and him, which gave her option points. She moved. She was 6 feet closer before a motion sensor triggered overhead, and the corridor lit up and his head came up and he turned. She was still moving. What happened in the next 9 seconds was not tactical in any clean sense. It was the specific ugly physics of 2 people in a narrow space with unequal preparation and unequal purpose. And the secondary oxygen console was between them for part of it and not for another part. And she took a hit to the right side of her jaw that made her vision fracture briefly and white out at the edges, and she did not stop because stopping was the option she could not afford. She got the thing out of his hands. That was what mattered, getting the device away from the console. She didn't know exactly what it was, and she didn't need to. She needed it not to be attached to the panel. It wasn't clean. Her shoulder, already damaged from the supply room, screamed when she put weight on it wrong. She compensated wrong and went down on one knee on the corridor floor, and he was above her for a moment, and she thought, with the specific clarity that came from situations where the margin was very small, if I don't get up right now, this goes the wrong way. She got up. The device was in her left hand. She looked at it. A magnetic interference unit, small, designed to disrupt electronic systems in a very local area, not destructive but specific. She'd seen the design before in a different context. He backed up. His calculation had changed. He hadn't expected her to still be standing, and she could see the recalibration happening in real time. The corridor door is going to open in about 30 seconds, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, which she noticed and accepted. Federal agents, if you're thinking about the maintenance exit at the end of this corridor, I'd like to know how you plan to get there while I'm standing in the way. He wasn't. He was looking at the panel, at the device in her hand, at what he'd almost done and had not managed to do. He needs to die, the man said. Not defensive, explanatory. The specific tone of someone who believed in the logic of what they were trying to do and found it reasonable to explain it. Not today, she said. The corridor door opened. 3 people came through it. 2 she recognized as the federal agents who had arrived on the surgical floor. And behind them, moving with the controlled speed of someone who had been briefed in transit, a man in uniform she did not recognize, but whose rank insignia she read in a single glance. Brigadier General, United States Army. He looked at the man at the end of the supply corridor, looked at the agents who were already moving to secure him, and then he looked at Claire, standing in the middle of the supply corridor with a magnetic interference device in her left hand and her right shoulder wrong and blood on her jaw from a hit that was going to leave something visible by morning. He stopped looking at everything else. Major Waverly, he said. She hadn't been called that in 3 years. The sound of it in this corridor, in this building, in the middle of this Tuesday that had not been what any Tuesday was supposed to be. The sound of it did something to her that she had not prepared for and could not entirely account for. Sir, she said. The patient in OR3, he said. Is he secure? For now, she said. The backup system was partially tampered with before I got here. You need your people to verify the console status before the primary system runs any automated handoff. He turned to one of the agents and said something in a low voice she didn't catch. The agent moved immediately toward the console. The general turned back to her. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was reading something, taking inventory, arriving at a conclusion that had been in formation for longer than this conversation. They told me you were here, he said. When Hale's transport was rerouted to this facility, we pulled the staff roster. Your name came up. I'm on staff, she said. Yes, he said. You are. He said it with the specific weight of someone for whom those 3 words contained a larger conversation that had not yet been had. The device in her hand, the corridor around her, the OR suite through the wall where Marcus Hale was still on the table, still being kept alive, still inside the 80 minutes that needed to go right. Her jaw was starting to swell. Her shoulder was going to be a problem by tomorrow. And outside this corridor, on the other side of the double doors, in the conference rooms and the administrative offices and the nursing stations of Mercy Holloway Medical Center, Dr. Maren Osfeld was going to have to be told something, was going to have to be given an account of this day that would require her to revise every assumption she had made in 9 weeks about the quiet nurse with the military posture who stood like she was about to get in a fight. The general said, "We need to talk about Kandahar Station." The agents at the console said something to each other in low tones, and one of them reached for their radio. And from the OR suite, through the wall, came a sound. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time in clinical environments to know what it meant. The sound of a monitor alarm activating, and then, a half-second later, the sound of surgical staff responding. Something had changed in OR3. She was already moving toward the OR suite door before the general finished his sentence about Kandahar Station, because Kandahar Station was 3 years ago and the monitor alarm was happening right now. The general didn't stop her. She registered that, the fact that he stepped aside rather than blocking her, that he made a quick hand gesture to the agents that she caught in peripheral vision and interpreted as let her go. And she filed it and pushed through the supply corridor door back into the main OR corridor and went straight to Suite 3. The scrub tech was visible through the small observation window in the OR door, moving fast, not panicking, but with the compressed urgency of someone managing a complication mid-procedure. Claire could see the surgical team's backs, the altered configuration of the staff around the table that told her something had changed in the last 4 minutes. The anesthesiologist was standing, which meant she was active, which meant the problem was on her side of the drape. Claire hit the intercom beside the door. What's happening? A beat. Then the anesthesiologist's voice clipped and sharp. Pressure drop. Unexpected. We're managing. The backup oxygen console in the supply corridor was tampered with, Claire said. The interference device was removed before deployment, but the console may have registered a partial disruption. Your backup lines are suspect. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, how partial? I don't know. You need to verify primary line integrity independently before you rely on any automated handoff. Another silence, longer. She could hear the controlled noise of the surgical team on the other side of the door. Then, primary is holding, we're stable, pressure's coming back up. Confirm the backup manually when you can, Claire said. "Will do." The voice shifted, slightly less clipped, the adjustment of someone releasing a breath they'd been holding. "Who am I talking to?" "ER staff, level 2. "How did you know about the console?" "Long story," Claire said, and released the intercom. She turned. The general was behind her, 2 feet back, having followed from the supply corridor. The agents were still with the man at the console, and she could hear one of them on a radio, the low rapid transmission of a field update being relayed up a chain. "She's stable," Claire said, meaning the patient, meaning the OR, meaning the next however many minutes. The console disruption was caught before it reached the primary lines. The general nodded. He had the face of a man who was accustomed to receiving information under pressure, and who had learned not to let what he felt show in his expression. But there was something around his eyes that Claire read as relief doing its best to stay professional. "Good," he said. "That's good." Then, after a beat, "You need your jaw looked at." She had almost forgotten about it. The swelling had progressed to the point where she could feel it at the edge of her vision, a low, persistent pressure on the right side of her face. "Later," she said. "You said that about the shoulder too, I'd guess." "Sir?" she said, which was not agreement and not disagreement, and which he apparently understood perfectly because he almost smiled. "Come with me," he said. "Not far. There's a family consultation room at the end of this corridor that your people use for difficult conversations. We're going to have one." She went with him. Not because she was required to. She had been a nurse for 9 weeks and a civilian for 3 years, and whatever authority his uniform carried did not technically extend to this hospital corridor. She went because the voice on the phone had told her that some of the people who wanted to talk to her were on her side, and she had decided provisionally that this might be one of them. The family consultation room was small and deliberately neutral. Upholstered chairs, a low table, a box of tissues that was half empty, the standard institutional kit for delivering news that was going to be hard to receive. The general sat down. Claire sat across from him. Her shoulder announced its opinion of the chair back, and she adjusted. "My name is Walden," he said. "Brigadier General Curtis Walden. I commanded the 75th Support Operations Group until 14 months ago, which means I was 2 levels above the unit you were assigned to at the time of Kandahar Station." She looked at him steadily. "I know who you are," she said. "I didn't recognize you in the corridor. I was stationed stateside for most of your deployment. We've never been in the same room." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. "What I know about you, I know from the record and from the people who served with you. I want to be direct with you about what I know and what I don't, because I think you deserve that, and because I think if I try to manage this conversation, you'll see through it immediately, and it'll waste both our time." She appreciated the directness. She didn't say so. "All right," she said. "The investigation that's been running for the last 6 months," he said. "The one that intersects with your previous unit's operation. You weren't a subject of it. You were a witness. A material witness, which is different, but because your file was sealed and your current location wasn't in the active database, you weren't reachable." She processed this. "The flag on my badge," she said. "The protective flag." "Correct. When you came up on staff at this facility, the flag activated because your name is in the witness index for the investigation. The flag is there because some of the people under investigation have the means and the motive to complicate a witness's availability." He paused. "Today's events are a data point in that regard." She sat with this for a moment. The shape of what he was describing was becoming clearer, and it was not a comfortable shape, but it was at least a coherent one. "The 2 men," she said, "the one from the supply room and the one from the OR corridor, they weren't here because of Hale." Walden looked at her. "No," he said. "Hale was the asset. Keeping him alive removes a critical testimony source for the other side. But the secondary objective," he stopped. "You were on the staff roster. Your name flagged for them the same time it flagged for us." The room was very quiet. "They came here to handle 2 problems at once," she said. "That's what we believe, yes." She looked at the half-empty tissue box, at the neutral upholstered chairs, at the window that overlooked a small interior courtyard with a concrete planter containing a shrub that was doing its best in a difficult environment. She thought about 9 weeks of Tuesday shifts and supply cart inventories, and Douglas Pratt telling her she stood like she was about to get in a fight. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A formal statement, your observation of both individuals, the sequence of events, the device you recovered. It needs to go into the investigative record." He paused. "And eventually testimony. But that's not today." "All right," she said. "There's something else." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put a folded document on the table between them. Not slid, placed with intention. "This has been sitting in a JAG office for 4 months, waiting for your current location to be confirmed. It's a formal review determination, Kandahar Station." She looked at the document, did not pick it up. "What did they determine?" "That your actions on the date in question were within the rules of engagement, consistent with your training, and that the outcome, while operationally costly, was not the result of error or misconduct on your part." He paused. "The 3 redactions in your file were protecting an ongoing operation, not concealing a finding against you. The finding, when it came, was a full clearance." She had carried something for 3 years that had the specific weight of an unresolved question. Not guilt, exactly, but the open space where a verdict should be. The procedural silence that had sent her out of service and into a nursing preceptorship in Briar Falls, Oregon, 9 weeks ago. The document on the table was not heavy. It was just paper. She picked it up. She didn't open it. She just held it for a moment and Walden let her, which was the right thing to do. "Thank you," she said. The words came out a little rough. She noted that and accepted it. "You should have had it months ago," he said. "I'm sorry for the delay." She put the document in her scrub pocket. "I need to get back to the floor," she said. "Your shift is technically—" "I know what my shift is," she said. "There are patients downstairs who need nursing staff, and I've been off the floor for over an hour." She stood up. "I'll give the statement. Tell me when and where, and I'll be there. But right now I'm going back to work." He looked at her from his chair. She couldn't read his expression entirely. It was doing several things at once, and one of them was something that might have been respect, though it was the kind that didn't need to announce itself. "Farrell's people will want to debrief you before end of day," he said. "Farrell is on the 3rd floor with a puncture wound," Claire said. "She can debrief me when she's stable." She left the room. The elevator back to the ER level took the same amount of time it always took. She stood inside it and felt the document in her scrub pocket and her jaw and her shoulder, and thought about the morning. Thought about a patient at 53 systolic, and a supply room, and a corridor in the dark, and a monitor alarm through a closed OR door. Thought about the voice that had said Major Waverly in a corridor where she had been nobody for 9 weeks. The elevator opened on the ER level, and she walked back into the noise. Rosario was at the station and looked up immediately. Her face went through a compressed sequence that ended on something that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Your jaw," she said. "I know. Do you need ice pack if we have one that's not committed to a patient?" Rosario produced one from the secondary supply cabinet without comment, which was one of the things Claire valued about her. "Pratt is looking for you," she said. "What does he want?" "He won't say. He's been at the station twice in the last half hour." Claire pressed the ice pack against her jaw. It was cold, and it helped. "Tell him I'm back on the floor," she said. "If he wants to find me, I'll be in Bay 3 checking on Marguerite and then in Bay 1 for the afternoon trauma rotation." She was in Bay 3 for 6 minutes before Pratt found her. Marguerite's cardiologist consult had come through. The findings were reassuring, a muscular strain rather than cardiac, and Marguerite was in the process of being relieved of several wires and prepared for a step-down. Her daughter was present and had modulated considerably from the morning's energy. "There you are," Pratt said from the bay entrance. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Something tighter than his usual condescension, something that suggested the afternoon had not been what he'd planned on either. "I'm here," she said without turning around. "Administration wants a full incident report from you, for the record." "I'll submit it at end of shift," she said. "They want it sooner." She turned and looked at him. He was standing with his arms crossed in the bay entrance, and his expression was doing a thing she recognized, the expression of someone who had lost the higher ground and was trying to reclaim it by enforcing procedural authority. I'm with a patient, she said, at end of shift. He looked at her jaw. He didn't say anything about it, which told her he'd heard something of what had happened and was recalibrating what it meant for the ground he was standing on. Osfeld is going to want an explanation, he said, for all of it. You were off the floor for... I was managing an active security situation on the surgical floor, she said. The documentation is with federal agents right now. Dr. Osfeld can contact the CMO's office if she has questions. Pratt stared at her. Excuse me, she said, and turned back to Marguerite. Behind her, after a moment, she heard him leave. Marguerite, from the bed, said, Was that satisfying? Marginally, Claire said. You have very good posture, Marguerite said, for a woman who just got hit in the face. Thank you, Claire said. How's the breathing feeling? The afternoon shifted and moved the way afternoons in emergency medicine did. Not cleanly, not in sequence, but in the overlapping way of a department that didn't pause for the convenience of narrative. She worked. She checked monitoring leads and updated charts and assisted a resident with a lumbar assessment and talked to 3 different family members about 3 different things. She managed the ice pack for 40 minutes and then put it back because she needed both hands. At 3:15, Lund appeared at the station. He stood beside her without preamble and said, low, Hale's out of surgery. She stopped writing. How is he? Surgical team says favorable outcome, stable in recovery. Lost a lot of blood, but the repair held. He paused. The surgical attending said, and I'm quoting, that without the posterior identification at intake, it would have been a different conversation. She went back to writing. Waverly, Lund said, I heard you. I don't think you're processing what I'm saying. I'm processing it, she said. It's good news. I'm glad. He was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, what you did in Bay 6 this morning, the assessment, the pushback, the whole thing. I've been doing trauma medicine for 22 years. I can count on one hand the number of people I've seen make that call that fast and that accurately. She looked up from the chart. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was the most genuine she'd seen him look all day. I'm not good at this part, he said. I know, she said, but thank you. He nodded once, brusquely, and walked away, which was the Lund version of a significant gesture. At 4:40, the CMO's office called down to the nursing station and asked Claire to come up. Not to conference room 1 this time, to Petty's office directly, which was a different kind of meeting. She went. Petty's office was large by hospital standards and furnished with the careful neutrality of an administrator who had learned that personal expression in an office was a liability. He was behind his desk. Osfeld was there, in a chair to the right, and across from her was a woman Claire hadn't met. Early 50s, navy blazer, the specific presentation of someone from legal or compliance who had been brought in to be present rather than to speak. And standing at the window, looking at the parking lot, General Walden. She had not expected him to be here. She sat in the remaining chair. Petty looked at her jaw and did not comment, which was the professional thing to do. We've had some significant developments this afternoon, Petty said. He sounded tired in the way that administrators sounded tired when a day had exceeded every category they had prepared for. I think we owe you a direct conversation about where things stand. All right, she said. The Department of Defense has been in contact with the hospital's board, he said. The situation involving today's patient and your role in it, both in Bay 6 this morning and on the surgical floor this afternoon, has been formally communicated to the board as a matter of record. Osfeld was looking at a point on the wall. It was the same point she had looked at in conference room 1, which Claire noted. We also received a communication, Petty continued, regarding your background, the military record. He paused. I want to say, on behalf of the institution, that we were not fully informed of the scope of your experience when you joined the staff. I want to be clear that this is not an excuse for how the department's culture received you. It's context. There's a difference. She looked at him. He was being careful, which was his nature, but he was also being genuine, which was more than she'd expected. I appreciate that, she said. Dr. Osfeld has something she wants to say, Petty said. The room was quiet. Osfeld turned from the wall point and looked at Claire. Her expression was complicated in the way that faces were when someone was doing something that cost them something real. "The escalation this morning," Osfeld said. "The pediatric patient. You were right about the presentation. The outcome confirmed your assessment." She stopped. "And in Bay 6, Another stop. "I should have listened faster." It was not an apology exactly. It was the closest to one that Osfeld's particular form of pride was capable of producing, and Claire understood that. She had enough self-awareness to know that her own apologies, when she owed them, came out equally compressed. "Thank you," Claire said. Walden turned from the window. "There are things that need to be handled administratively," he said, "regarding the events of today. Nurse Waverly cooperated with the federal response to an active security situation in this building and sustained physical injury in the course of doing so. I want that in the institutional record clearly and accurately." "It will be," Petty said. "We're also—" He glanced at the woman in the navy blazer, who gave a small nod. "Reviewing the staff environment on the ER floor more broadly. Today surfaced things that were already there." She thought about Pratt, about the 9 weeks of small indignities that hadn't broken anything but had accumulated, about the pediatric patient whose presentation had been missed by people who could have listened faster. "That review," she said, "should be thorough." Petty met her eyes. "It will be," he said again, and this time the tiredness in his voice had a different quality. The quality of someone who had decided something and was going to carry through on it regardless of how uncomfortable the carrying was. She left the office at 5:10 and went back to the floor and finished the last hour and 40 minutes of her shift with the same thoroughness she applied to every shift, which was the only way she knew how to do it. She updated charts, handed off 3 patients, confirmed the cardiology follow-up for Marguerite, and ate half a granola bar from her locker because she had not eaten since 4 a.m., and the granola bar was accurate information about what her body needed, and she respected accurate information. At 6:50, she was at the locker room changing out of her scrubs when her phone buzzed. A text from the Virginia number, Walden, she assumed, or someone from his office. "Patient in recovery, conscious, asking to speak with intake nurse from this morning. Your call. No obligation." She stood in the locker room with the text on her screen and thought about it. She was off shift. Her jaw was a specific color that Rosario had looked at with professional concern before Claire left the floor. Her shoulder would need ice, and probably a few days to tell her exactly how bad the decision she'd made in the supply room had been. She typed back, "Room number." The recovery suite was on the 4th floor, past the surgical ward, a quieter set of rooms designed for the specific purpose of the hours immediately after major surgery, so close enough to the OR that escalation was fast, removed enough from the ICU that the atmosphere was marginally less acute. She found the room, knocked, was told to come in. Marcus Hale was in the bed at a 30-degree incline, which was what a repaired vascular injury allowed at this stage. He was pale in the way that significant blood loss left you, a particular drained quality that 2 units of transfusion hadn't fully corrected yet. And there were lines and monitoring leads and the normal hardware of immediate post-surgical care. He looked like a man who had come very close to a threshold and was sitting on the near side of it, still catching his breath. He was also, she noted, more alert than she'd expected. He looked at her when she came in. She was in street clothes now, jeans and a dark jacket, and she watched him take in the bruising on her jaw and reach whatever conclusion he reached about it. "You're Waverly," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "Yes." "I'm told you found the secondary bleed." "Yes." "And this afternoon—" He stopped, breathed carefully, the deliberate breath of someone whose abdominal wall was newly repaired and reminding them of its opinions. "They told me what happened in the supply corridor." She stood at the foot of his bed. "You don't need to—" "I'm a deputy director of defense intelligence," he said. "I'm allowed to acknowledge what someone did for me." He looked at her steadily. The alertness in his eyes was real. Not medicated away, not soft. Whatever this man was when he was at full capacity, he was enough of it right now to be having this conversation deliberately. "Walden told me about your record, the investigation, what's been sitting in the JAG office." "He told me too," she said. "Good. He was quiet for a moment. Kandahar Station, he said. I know the file. What happened there, what you did and what it cost. That should have been resolved 3 years ago. The institutional failure there was on us, not you. She looked at him. With respect, sir, I don't need that from you right now. I know you don't, he said. I'm saying it anyway. He shifted slightly and his expression made a brief detour through pain before returning to its baseline. When I'm back at full capacity, there are going to be conversations about the investigation, about what comes next, about people who are going to face consequences for what was set in motion today and before today. Your name is going to come up in those conversations. I assumed. I want you to know, he said, that when it does, it's going to come up correctly. She stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. The monitoring equipment beeped at regular intervals. Outside the window, the parking lot below was in the early stages of the shift change exodus, cars moving, the ordinary end of an ordinary Tuesday for everyone who had not been inside this building today. Thank you, she said. She meant it, which made it simple to say. She was at the door when he said, Walden wants to offer you something, formally, through the right channels. She stopped, but didn't turn around. I'm a nurse, she said. I know what you are, Hale said. He wants to offer it anyway. She pushed the door open and went into the corridor and walked to the elevator and rode it down to the lobby level and pushed through the main entrance into the November air, which was cold and smelled like concrete and the distant edge of rain. She stood on the hospital steps for a moment. The document was in her jacket pocket, transferred from her scrubs. The JAG determination. 3 years old and 4 months late, and hers. She thought about Walden's offer. The thing Hale had been referring to, the thing she hadn't let him finish. She had a reasonable idea of its shape. She had been in this world long enough to know what came after a day like this one. The way institutions offered things that were meant to be reparations and turned out to be recruitments. She was not sure what she wanted to do with that yet. What she was sure of was that tomorrow morning she would be at the hospital by 6:15 because her shift started at 6:30 and she was not the kind of person who cut arrival margins close. She would check the supply carts and update herself on the overnight cases and drink her coffee at the nursing station and do her job. And when Osfeld walked past, it would be different. Not fixed. She had no illusions about institutional culture and how fast it moved or didn't move, but different. The particular difference of a day that had changed the information everyone was working from. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Local area code, not Virginia. She answered it. This is Agent Dara Noel, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A woman's voice, professional, clipped. I'm trying to reach Claire Waverly. Speaking, she said. Ms. Waverly, I'm the lead investigator on an operation that I believe you were briefed on today, partially by General Walden. A pause. I need you to know that our investigation intersects with his, but we're separate agencies with separate mandates. And there's information that General Walden does not have that I believe you're entitled to. The cold air, the parking lot, the rain smell getting closer. What information? She said. The 2 men detained at Mercy Holloway this afternoon, Noel said. We've been running their affiliations. The organization they're connected to has been active for 14 months. We have documentation of 4 operations in that period. A pause that had weight in it. One of those operations took place 3 years ago, at a location that would be in your file under a code name. She went very still. Kandahar Station, Nowell said. Ms. Waverly, what happened there wasn't an operational failure. It was a targeted compromise. Someone fed bad intelligence to your unit, deliberately. The people responsible for that are the same people who sent 2 men into your hospital this morning. The steps of Mercy Holloway Medical Center. November air. The document in her pocket that said full clearance in language that had arrived 4 months late. The thing that had lived in the unresolved space for 3 years. The open question that the JAG determination closed procedurally, but not entirely, was suddenly something different. Not a question anymore. An answer that opened into something larger. I'm going to need you to say that again, Claire said. I know, Noel said. Can we meet? Yes, Claire said. Tell me where. They met 40 minutes later at a diner 3 blocks from the hospital. A place called Patton's that had been there since the 80s and smelled like coffee and fryer oil and the particular permanence of a business that had outlasted everything around it. Agent Nowell was already in a corner booth when Claire arrived. Late 40s, dark coat, a face that had spent too many years looking at things that required professional neutrality and had developed it thoroughly. She had a folder on the table and a coffee she hadn't touched. Claire sat down. "Talk," she said. Nowell talked. It took 45 minutes and 2 cups of coffee. And the folder, which had been curated, specific pages, not everything, the parts that Nowell had decided Claire needed in order to understand the shape of what had actually happened at Kandahar Station 3 years ago and what had been happening in the 14 months since. Claire listened without interrupting, which was difficult at certain points and easy at others, and read what she was shown when she was shown it, and sat with the accumulation of it. The short version was this: a man named Colonel Elliot Brassard, who had been the intelligence liaison attached to Claire's unit's operational command, had been running a secondary channel for 18 months before Kandahar Station. He had been selling position data and operational timing to a network that had interests in the region that were directly counter to American ones. The bad intelligence that had sent Claire's team into a compromised location had not been an analytical failure. It had been deliberate. Brassard had known what he was sending them into. 2 people from her unit had died at Kandahar Station. She had known that. She had carried it for 3 years with the specific weight of deaths that felt like failures, even when the logic said otherwise. What she had not known was that the feeling had been accurate, not accurate in the way that assigned her blame, but accurate in the way that said something had been wrong that wasn't random and wasn't operational error. Something had been done. "Brassard," she said. The name sat on her tongue like a stone. "Where is he now?" "Detained as of this afternoon," Nowell said. The 2 men at Mercy Holloway this morning had direct traceable contact with Brassard's network. That gave us the predicate we needed for the arrest warrant. He was picked up at 4:50 p.m. at his residence in Falls Church. She absorbed this. "What are the charges?" "Federal. Multiple counts, espionage statutes, conspiracy, and, because of what was set in motion at your hospital today, 2 counts of attempted murder in furtherance of a federal crime." Nowell paused. "The DA's office has been briefed. We expect indictment within 72 hours. The evidence package is substantial." Claire looked at the table, at the folder, at her coffee cup. "The 2 people who died," she said. "Sergeant First Class Maeve Ortega and Corporal David Thin." She said the names carefully because they deserved to be said carefully, and she had not said them out loud in a long time. "Their families." "The Army is handling the family notifications," Nowell said. "That process began this evening. Walden authorized it." She nodded. Something in her chest moved in a way that she didn't try to categorize. It was too complicated and too old and too new simultaneously, and she had learned that not everything needed to be identified immediately to be real. "Is there anything you need from me tonight?" she said. "No," Nowell said. "The formal statement can wait until tomorrow. You've had enough of today." Claire looked at her. "That's surprisingly considerate for a federal investigator." "I've been doing this for 20 years, Nowell said. "I've learned the difference between what needs to happen tonight and what can wait until morning." A pause. "Get your jaw looked at." "Everyone keeps saying that," Claire said. "Everyone is right," Nowell said. She walked back to the hospital because her car was in the parking structure and the 3 blocks in cold air were useful, and she stood in the parking structure for a moment before getting in and drove home and sat in her kitchen at 9:47 p.m. and ate a real meal for the first time since 4 a.m. and did not think about Brassard or the investigation or the document in her jacket pocket or Walden's offer. She thought about Maeve Ortega, who had been 29 years old and had known more about field expedient wound management than most battlefield physicians, and who had made a very specific joke in the 30 seconds before everything went wrong at Kandahar Station that Claire had replayed more times than she could count, because it was the last ordinary moment before the world changed. She thought about David Thin, who had been quiet in the way that some people were quiet, not withdrawn, just economical, like he had learned early that not every thought needed a public airing and had applied that lesson thoroughly. She thought about what it meant that their deaths had not been the cost of an operation gone wrong through the accumulated chaos of a dangerous world, but the result of a deliberate decision made by a man in a nice office who had found their lives an acceptable line item in a transaction. She stayed with that for a long time. Then she went to bed and slept, because tomorrow started at 4 a.m., and she was still a nurse on a 6:30 shift. The next 17 days were not simple. There was the formal FBI statement, which took 3 hours and was conducted in a conference room downtown that smelled like dry erase markers and old carpet, and which required her to be accurate and precise and thorough about a sequence of events she had mostly been too busy to process while they were happening. Nowell ran the interview. She was good at it, asking questions that were specific without being leading, leaving space, not filling silences that were doing useful work. Claire gave her what she had, accurately, without embellishment or compression. There was the JAG follow-up, which was less an interview than a confirmation. The formal communication of findings that she had already read in the document, now made official across multiple channels and entered into the permanent record in the ways that mattered institutionally. The 3 redactions in her file were removed. What replaced them was not dramatic. A sequence of clinical decisions under fire and an assessment of those decisions that concluded, plainly, that she had done what she was trained to do in conditions that had been deliberately made worse by a superior officer who had betrayed his commission. There was a phone call from the families, 2 of them, on separate days. She had not asked for these calls and had not expected them, and they were the hardest things in the 17 days, not because they were angry, which she had been prepared for, but because they were not. Maeve Ortega's mother, a woman named Rosa, who spoke with the specific directness of someone who had been sitting with an incomplete story for 3 years and had finally been given the missing pieces, said, "I want you to know that I know it wasn't you." That was all. It was enough. David Thinn's older brother said very little but stayed on the phone for a long time. And Claire let him, because sometimes the point of a conversation was not the words in it. There was also, in the middle of all of this, the ongoing fact of the hospital. She went to work every day. She checked the supply carts, she updated the charts, she managed the triage and the trauma rotations, and the families who needed information delivered with accuracy and human decency. She ate better than she had in weeks, because Rosario, who had apparently decided that feeding people was a reasonable response to situations she could not otherwise fix, started leaving food at the nursing station around 11 a.m. with the casual air of someone who did not intend to make it a thing. Pratt filed a formal complaint on the 3rd day. It was a preemptive document, citing her unauthorized access to the Base 6 situation on the morning of the incident, her absence from the floor for over an hour, her failure to complete documentation in the standard window. The complaint was technically accurate in its particulars. It was also, given the context that had since been communicated to hospital administration via several federal agencies, an impressively poorly timed piece of bureaucratic self-preservation. Petty reviewed it. The woman in the navy blazer, whose name turned out to be Harriet Voss, and who was the hospital's director of compliance, reviewed it alongside him. The review concluded in 4 days, and its findings were communicated to the ER floor in a staff meeting that Claire attended alongside 11 other nurses and 4 residents, in which Pratt also attended, with the expression of someone who had realized too late that the document he'd filed had been read by people he hadn't considered when he filed it. The findings were specific. Pratt's complaint was dismissed in full. The dismissal letter, which Voss read aloud in part, noted that the circumstances of the date in question did not constitute a protocol violation by Waverly and that the complaint appeared to reflect a pattern of conduct toward the respondent that was itself under review. That phrase, "a pattern of conduct toward the respondent that was itself under review," landed in the room with the particular weight of language that everyone present understood had consequences attached to it. Pratt left the meeting early. Nobody stopped him. Osfeld stayed for the entire meeting. She said nothing during it and nothing after it, but when Claire passed her in the corridor afterward, she gave her a nod, brief, unelaborated, that carried in it the specific acknowledgement of someone who had been required by events to update their understanding of a person and had done so. It wasn't warmth. Claire didn't need warmth from Osfeld. She needed accuracy, and accuracy was what she got. On the 11th day, General Walden came to the hospital. Not officially, not in uniform, not with an appointment. He came at 11:15 a.m. in civilian clothes and found her at the nursing station and said he had 20 minutes and asked if she had 20 minutes. And she told Rosario she'd be in the break room and took him there. The break room smelled like microwaved food and the old coffee that accumulated in carafes through the course of a shift. He sat across from her at the small table and looked slightly out of place in the way that people who spent most of their professional lives in formal environments look slightly out of place in rooms designed for casual recovery. "The offer," he said, "that Hale mentioned." "Yes," she said. "I want to be straightforward about what it is and what it isn't," he said. "It's not a reinstatement. You'd be civilian, contracted. A specific role attached to a joint task force that's currently being restructured in the aftermath of Broussard and his network." "What role?" she said. "Medical intelligence assessment," he said, "which is a formal way of saying that you have a combination of clinical expertise and operational experience that most people in this field have one of and not the other. The task force needs people who can work across both." She looked at the coffee carafe, at the motivational calendar on the break room wall, which was showing a photograph of a mountain with a caption about persistence. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I know what you are," Walden said. "I'm asking if that's all you want to be." It was a reasonable question. She had been asking herself a version of it for 11 days, in the early morning hours between 4 a.m. and the start of her shift, in the particular clarity that came from having the unresolved question resolved and needing to figure out what came after it. "It's not a choice between one thing and the other," she said. "Is it?" "No," he said. "The role is structured for someone who maintains clinical practice. That's part of the value." She thought about Bay 6. About 53 systolic and a posterior assessment that had taken 22 seconds. About Farrell in a supply room buying time with a puncture wound and a voice. About the supply corridor and the magnetic device and the sound of the OR monitor through the wall. About the fact that all of those things had used, in roughly equal measure, what she had learned in uniform and what she had learned in 9 weeks of civilian nursing, and that the combination had been the point. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Take the time," he said. "There's no deadline." "There's always a deadline," she said. He almost smiled. 2 weeks, he said. "After that, I have to staff it another way." She looked at him. "A week," she said. "I'll have an answer in a week." He left at 11:40. She went back to the floor. The answer came to her not in one moment, but in accumulation, the way most real decisions did. Not a sudden clarity, but a gradual settling, like sediment finding the bottom of a container that had been agitated and was finally going still. She thought about Maeve and David and what it meant that their deaths had been preventable, not by any action she could have taken in the moment, but by the earlier catching of something that someone in a position to catch it had chosen not to catch. She thought about what it meant to have the kind of knowledge she had and to apply it only in one place, in one direction. She thought about the pediatric patient on her first week who had been telling anyone who looked carefully that she was working too hard to breathe. She thought about 53 systolic. She thought about the kind of attention that the world generally did not reward in women who wore scrubs and did not announce their credentials and stood with military posture and were told, repeatedly, to stay in their lane. She had spent 3 years trying to make herself simple. It hadn't worked. The world had found her anyway, and when it did, the thing that had mattered was not that she had made herself smaller, but that she had stayed accurate. Accurate about what she knew, accurate about what she saw, accurate about what was required in the specific moment in front of her, regardless of who was telling her to stand down. You couldn't make that small. You could be quiet about it, which she had been. You could be strategic about when you used it, which she had learned to be. But you could not make it into something that fit into a box that other people had decided was the appropriate size for a woman in your position. She called Walden on the 7th day. "Yes," she said when he picked up. A pause. "You sure?" he said. "I'll need the clinical schedule accommodated," she said. "I'm not leaving the floor entirely." "Understood," he said. "We'll make it work." "And Walden," she said. "Yes." If there's ever a moment where the two things conflict, where the task force wants something that compromises patient care, I'll choose patient care. That's not a negotiation point. It's just how it is. A pause that she couldn't fully read. Then, I wouldn't have it any other way, he said, and he sounded like he meant it. But the formal announcement at Mercy Holloway came at the end of the month. It was not a big announcement. Hospitals did not generally make theatrical statements about staff roles, and Claire had not asked for one. It was a memo from the CMO's office, distributed to department heads and posted in the internal staff portal, noting that Claire Waverly, RN, had been appointed to the newly created position of Critical Trauma Coordination Specialist, effective the first of the following month, with oversight authority over mass casualty response protocols and direct reporting to both the CMO and the senior trauma attending on duty during declared emergency events. The position had not existed before. Petty had created it in consultation with Voss and Lund, and at some point that she had not been present for, with input from the federal agencies that had developed a sudden interest in Mercy Holloway's emergency infrastructure. The title was accurate without being theatrical. It was exactly the kind of thing that changed how a room oriented toward you when you walked into it. She found out about the memo when Rosario forwarded it to her phone at 7:40 a.m. on the day it was distributed, with no accompanying text, which was the Rosario version of a significant gesture. Pratt was formally placed on a performance improvement plan the same week, with documentation noting a sustained pattern of obstructive behavior toward junior staff and 2 specific incidents of undermining patient care through interpersonal interference. He remained on staff. These things moved slowly, and Claire had not expected otherwise. But the nature of his position had shifted in ways that everyone on the floor understood, even if the paperwork was still in process. The shift itself was the thing that was harder to name, but more significant. The ER floor had a different quality in the weeks that followed. Not transformed, not suddenly harmonious, because places like that did not transform into harmonious ones, and Claire did not believe in that version of change. It was more that the frame of reference had shifted. The information everyone was working from was different, and different information changed behavior even in people who would not have described themselves as having behaved based on insufficient information in the first place. Residents asked her questions now. Not deferentially. She didn't want deference, and she made that clear quickly, but with the specific directness of people who had concluded that she was worth asking. 2 of the nurses who had kept their distance for 9 weeks started talking to her in the break room, which was small and ordinary and mattered. Lund remained himself, which meant he was still technically difficult and personally terse, and gave acknowledgement rarely enough that it meant something when he did. He stopped talking over her in trauma bays, which he had actually done very rarely since the 2nd week. He started consulting her on intake calls before the patient arrived, when the dispatch information gave enough to work with. It was a form of respect that did not need to call itself respect, which was the form Claire preferred. Osfeld sent her a case study in the 4th week. Just a message. Curious about your read on this. A pediatric presentation, somewhat unusual, with imaging and vitals attached. Claire read it, thought about it, and sent back 3 paragraphs. Okay. Not tentative, not hedged, just what she thought and why. Osfeld responded with 2 sentences of her own analysis that engaged with Claire's directly, as one clinician to another. It was not a friendship. It was something more durable than friendship, in some ways. It was professional respect between 2 people who had started from a position of mutual friction and arrived somewhere more honest. Claire had learned to accept that some relationships were going to look like this, and that was fine. You did not need warmth from everyone. You needed accuracy. Farrell recovered. She was out of Mercy Holloway in 4 days. Puncture wound, lateral, clean, no organ involvement, which was as much luck as anything else, and Farrell acknowledged that privately when she stopped by the ER floor on her discharge day to say something she didn't have to say. "Thank you," she said, finding Claire at the nursing station. "For the supply room." "You were buying time," Claire said. "I just closed the gap." "Most people would have walked past that door," Farrell said. "Most people," Claire said, "hadn't heard you in there." Farrell looked at her for a moment with the same focused attention she'd had from the beginning, the attention of someone whose professional life required accurate assessment of other people and who applied it without apology. "You're good at this," she said, "at all of it, the clinical part and the other part." "I know," Claire said. It came out without false modesty because false modesty was a form of inaccuracy, and she didn't practice it. Farrell almost smiled. The real version this time. not the compressed almost smile from the conference room. "I know you know," she said. "That's what I mean." She left. Claire went back to the chart she'd been writing. Colonel Elliot Brassard was indicted on 7 federal counts in the 3rd week of December, 26 days after his arrest. The indictment was public record, which meant it was in the news, briefly, in the way that complicated federal cases involving intelligence agencies were briefly in the news before the complexity of their actual content caused most coverage to move on. Claire read the indictment documents when they were available, carefully and completely, because she had learned a long time ago that you did not look away from things just because looking at them cost you something. The charges were 2 counts of espionage, 3 counts of conspiracy in furtherance of treason, 1 count of obstruction of justice for the conduct that had shaped the post-Kandahar investigation, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder in the 1st degree, the latter related to the network's decision to send 2 men into Mercy Holloway Medical Center on a Tuesday in November with 2 objectives, one of which had been her name. The conspiracy to commit murder charge carried the longest sentence of the 7 counts. The federal prosecutor's office noted in their press statement that they expected to seek the maximum. She read that and sat with it, and thought about Maeve Ortega's mother saying, "I want you to know that I know it wasn't you," and thought about what it meant to carry something for 3 years that had been placed on you by someone else's deliberate choice. She thought about how long she had believed, on some level that logic couldn't entirely reach, that she had missed something, that a better version of her would have seen it coming, caught the error, saved them. 3 years of that. And underneath it, all along, the truth. That the error had been intentional and had been aimed at her team specifically, and that nothing she could have done on the ground that day would have changed what a man in a nice office in Falls Church had decided to do. You couldn't always see it coming. That was not a failure of attention. That was the specific way that betrayal worked. It required trust. It moved through the channels that trust created. And the only way to prevent it entirely was to trust nothing, which made you into something else entirely and destroyed the thing you were trying to protect. She had trusted her command. That was not a mistake. What Brassard had done with that trust was his crime, not her error. It had taken her 3 years and a Tuesday in November to finish understanding this. She was not sure she was entirely finished, but she was close enough to move forward. December moved toward its end. The hospital did what hospitals did. It continued, undeterred by seasons or institutional crises, the flow of people who needed care cycling through its doors with the democratic indifference of human physical vulnerability. She worked her shifts. She worked the new role alongside them, which meant 3 meetings in the first 2 weeks with Walden's task force counterparts, and 1 briefing with Nowell's team that lasted 4 hours and was the most cognitively demanding thing she'd done since the day she'd started all of this. She did not find the 2 things incompatible. That surprised her slightly, and then did not surprise her at all, because she had always been someone who needed the work to be real and concrete, who needed to feel the specific weight of consequence in what she did, who could not sustain herself on abstraction alone. The clinical floor gave her that in the most immediate way possible. A person in front of you, a problem with a timeline, a body with specific needs. The task force work gave her something larger, the frame that surrounded individual moments, the upstream factors, the machinery of decisions that determined which crises arrived at which ER floors on which Tuesdays. Both were necessary. She had not known that about herself before this month. She knew it now. On the last Friday of December, she was finishing a chart at the nursing station at the end of her shift when she became aware of Osfeld standing nearby. Not calling to her, just present, in the way that Osfeld was present, which was always deliberate. She finished the chart entry, saved it, and turned. Osfeld was holding a coffee cup and looking at the department around them. The movement, the sound, the particular organized intensity of an ER floor that had been at it for 12 hours and was heading into the evening. "You're staying on," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Claire said. "The new role. And the floor." "Yes." Osfeld was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone composing something that was harder to say than its words made it look. "I made assumptions about you," she said, "in the first weeks. Assumptions I shouldn't have made and didn't examine." "You did," Claire said. "I'm not asking you to." Osfeld stopped, started again. "I'm not explaining it to excuse it. I know what it was. I had a model of what a person in your role looked like, and you didn't match it, and I used that as a justification for being dismissive. She looked at Claire directly. That's a description, not a defense. Claire looked back at her. I know the difference, she said. Thank you for saying it. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside the department's main entrance, the evening shift was starting. The changing of the guard that happened every 12 hours, regardless of what the previous 12 had contained. The pediatric case, Osfeld said. The one I sent you. Your read was right. I thought it might be, Claire said. I want to do a formal case review, Osfeld said. For the department. The presentation, the assessment, what we missed on intake. I'd like you to present it. Claire considered this. All right, she said. I know what it'll require, Claire said. Set the date and I'll prepare. Osfeld nodded. She turned to go and then stopped, which was not something Claire had seen her do before. Osfeld generally moved in one direction until she arrived where she was going. She turned back. What you did on the day of the Hale case, she said, in Bay 6 and afterward, all of it. She paused. I've been a physician for 28 years. I've worked with talented people for most of that time. What you have... She stopped again, and something moved across her face that was effortful. It doesn't have a credential that captures it. That's the honest thing I can say about it. She left before Claire could respond to that, which was probably intentional. Claire stood at the nursing station and listened to the evening shift taking over, the small transactions of handoff and update that moved the department from one set of hands to another. The overhead lights, the paging system. The particular quality of a department that was always beginning something, always in the middle of something, always finishing something else simultaneously. She thought about the morning, 9 weeks ago, when she had driven to this building in the dark and stood at the nursing station for the first time and known, with the accurate, uncomfortable knowledge of someone who had learned to read rooms, that most people in this place had already decided what she was before she'd done a single thing. She thought about what it cost, over time, to be seen inaccurately. Not the dramatic cost. Not the days like November's Tuesday, which had been large and dangerous and unambiguous. The ordinary cost. The slow expenditure of energy that came from existing in a space that was constantly misreading you, that required you to manage its misreading on top of every actual task, that added to every interaction a layer of negotiation that other people in the room simply did not have to pay. She thought about the nurses and the residents and the people earlier in their careers who were paying that same cost right now, in this building and in every building like it, who had not had a Tuesday that clarified everything and who would continue paying it quietly, doing excellent work inside the constraints of other people's limited vision. That was the thing she had not been able to name before and could name now, the waste of it. Not the indignity, though the indignity was real, but the waste. The things that didn't get caught because the person who would have caught them had been told, firmly and repeatedly, to stay in their lane. The patients who came close to a threshold they didn't need to come close to because the room was oriented wrong. She had changed one room. One department, partially, provisionally, with a lot still in process and nothing guaranteed to hold. That was not a small thing, and she was not going to pretend it was small. But it was also not enough to make her feel finished, and she had decided that was all right. That not feeling finished was not a failure, but an orientation, the specific direction you needed to be pointed if you were going to keep doing work that mattered. She picked up her bag and her jacket. She said goodnight to Rosario, who said it back without looking up from her screen, which was also the Rosario version of something warm. She walked through the department and out the main entrance into the December night, cold, the parking lot half empty at this hour, her breath visible in the air. She had a meeting with Walden's task force on Monday. She had a chart review with Osfeld in 2 weeks. She had a shift tomorrow morning starting at 6:30, which meant 4 a.m. and cold water on her face and coffee over the kitchen sink. She had the names Maeve Ortega and David Thin, which she would carry for the rest of her life and which deserved to be carried, not as weight that broke her, but as weight that oriented her, that kept her accurate about what this work was actually for and who it was actually about. She walked to her car. The night was clear. Briar Falls was quiet in the way of a city that had not stopped moving but had lowered its volume for the evening, and somewhere in the middle of it, on the 4th floor of a building 3 blocks away, an OR suite was lit and in use because the work did not stop at the end of a shift or the end of a month or the end of a story. She had not asked to be seen. She had not performed for it, had not angled for it, had not made herself legible in the ways that institutions generally required before they were willing to look. She had done her job, accurately, thoroughly, with the full weight of everything she knew and everything she had survived brought to bear on the person in front of her. And the world had eventually had to look because the alternative was ignoring something it could not afford to ignore. That was not a lesson she would have chosen. It was the one she had. She got in the car and drove home through the December dark, and the road was ordinary and the night was ordinary, and she was, in every way that mattered, exactly where she was supposed to be.